Hello, everybody. This is Stefano, Oral Source News. Apologies for not having made a long content video in a while. Just wanted to give you guys a new video covering on the situation in the state of Sonora. This follows my series of long video formats covering various different states in Mexico that have high levels of violence. I've already covered Sinaloa, for example. I've covered Tamaulipas. I've covered the situation in Michoacan. And now I want to cover another state that sees regular amount of cartel violence, and that's the state of Sonora. And so here, as always, we're going to start with the great source of SITREP. It's a great open source intelligence tool that gives you alerts, intelligence, and assessments and analysis on all the countries around the world and over 500 topics as well. And so here we're going to go with the state of Sonora. Here we see an interesting development that happened that really highlights the problem. I think a lot of people, when we're talking about Mexico um, in cartel violence, that I think doesn't necessarily get connected, and that's kind of the impunity and the corruption that impacts both the local, state, and federal governments. Here we have a perfect example of Mexico arrests ex-guards for the 2010 prison massacre. And here you have the different areas where the violence occurred. As you can see here, the riot sites, the people that have been indicted, all these are government officials. And again, the thing about Mexico is when we're talking about it in corruption, I think most people can view the corruption, and I've said this in other videos and episodes. People analyze corruption in Mexico as in cartels have the power and then they corrupt the government officials, right? So basically, the cartel are the corrupting power, and they find government officials at the local, state, and federal level that they bribe, and it's kind of like these government officials then do the work of the cartels, which absolutely exists. Do not get me wrong. But I think there's another aspect of this, and is which the government officials have the power of the corruption, right? And either they act as criminal organizations independently, in other words, they have their own rings of corrupt practices, just led by either a law enforcement agency or other government bodies, or even the government officials, as they have the power, they can dictate to the cartels how they want them to operate, and they just want to kick back because they have the power of the weapons, of the government authority, of the military or the police. And if the cartels doesn't do their bidding, then the government officials can then go after the cartels because they're not doing as they're told, right? But here, this is an interesting alert that we received that the Sonora State Attorney General's office executed arrest warrants against two former prison officials for their alleged roles in a deadly incident following a riot at the Agua Prieto prison in 2010. Agua Prieto is right here, as you can see. Here's where the people that were detained, and they were detained in Guaymas, which is right over here. That's highlighted right here, and over here as well. And one of them was a former commander. So again, this kind of goes into a problem that Mexico has of overall impunity, in which government officials basically act in many ways either as criminal organizations themselves, and some almost up to cartels. And this incident in Sonora happened in 2010, or 15 years later, and finally there's some accountability for these violent actions. But again, just wanted to show this alert for Sonora. This caught my eye, and I thought it was a very interesting development, and wanted to share it to you guys here. Now, going specifically to the situation in Sonora, I think what you're going to see in Sonora over here in Northwest, and it's important to know, like as you saw on the map, Sonora borders mostly Arizona, right? It's an important drug trafficking route into the United States. Um, it has always been a major focus of various cartels, specifically the Sinaloa cartel has had a very important control over the state of Sonora. I mean, El Chapo's famous tunnels, a lot of them were in Sonora to push drugs into the United States. But what we've seen, in the last couple of years, really since 2023, is the degradation of the power and control that the Sinaloa cartel has in Sonora, right? And in my Sinaloa video, I talked about the cartels, the Sinaloa cartel civil war, when Los Chapitos and Los Mayitos Flacos, broke off, and now they're fighting a very violent conflict around Sinaloa. Uh, Before that civil war, there was another split that really hit Sonora, but really targeted the Chapitos more than others, and that is when various groups allied to Los Chapitos in Sonora broke off in 2023 to kind of form their own loosely organization called Los Independent Cartel of Sonora, which is here highlighted in yellow, El Cartel Independiente de Sonora. to battle Los Chapitos and for control. And as you can see in the map, I mean, this loosely organization has been the predominant now player in Sonora. The independent cartel of Sonora is made up of mainly three main groups, right? It's Los Salazars, Los Paredes, and then Los Fantasmas, also called Cazadores, right? Those are the three main ones: Salazars, Paredes, Fantasmas, Cazadores. And they have really managed to chip away at the control, the dominance that those Chapitos had in the state of Sonora since 2023. Inside of Sonora, right, with Los Chapitos, um, so right here, this is Los Cazadores, as highlighted here. Los Chapitos' main faction that operates in Sonora, still loyal to the Chapitos, is a group called Los Delta Pelones, right? Either Delta Pelones. Generally, we use both Delta Pelones. The Delta Pelones faction of Los Chapitos is the main player in Sonora, and they're the one that are fighting the independent cartel of Sonora. And they're fighting, again, Los Alfa Cazadores, they're fighting Los Salazars. Los Paredes are more active in the border areas, right? So generally, they're further out. If I'm not mistaken, I believe they actually have a main control over Aguas Prietos. So they're generally over there. But the key reason why Los Paredes is so important is because they control a border town that enables the shipment of drugs and human and migrants or any other products through that port of entry into the United States, right? So they're the ones that just basically control that border plaza. That's super important. But Los Salazars and Los Cazadores are the ones that are fighting Los Chapitos, specifically Los Chapitos, Los Delta Pelones. So here you have it. Again, here they kind of put Los Cazadores in altar. It's important to note that Los Cazadores are also considered part of the independent cartel of Sonora, Los Salazar, Los Paredes, and Los Cazadores. You also have the presence, which is now a significantly smaller cartel, and that's the Caborca cartel. The Caborca cartel was funded and created by Rafael Caro Quintero, who if that name might ring a bell, Rafael Caro Quintero was responsible for the death and assassination of Kiki Camarera, the DEA agent in Mexico. He was detained. He escaped prison in 2023. A couple years ago, he was recaptured in Mexico, and during the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, because the Mexican government, Claudia Sheinbaum, was so concerned about tariffs, they extradited dozens of cartel leaders into the United States. One of the key ones they extradited was Rafael Caro Quintero, who is now waiting. He's been indicted by the United States, and his trial is still ongoing for various crimes, to include the death of Kiki Camarena. And the DEA finally has a sense of justice that they can bring Rafael Caro Quintero to a U.S. federal court and, be indicted, and finally we can get justice for Kiki Camarena. So the Caborca cartel is active in Sonora as well, but they are a very minor player at this point. I think a lot of people have this impression that the Caborca cartel might still be very prevalent. They're the smaller player and overall in the situation in Sonora. The main one continues to be the Cartel Independiente de Sonora and Los Chapitos with the Delta Pelones. There are another important group that operates in Sonora under Los Mallitos Flacos, and it's right here. Los Mallitos Flacos do have an important control over areas of Sonora, and one of the main factions that they have in this area, also in the border area between Sonora and Baja California, Los Rusos. Los Rusos are a very key faction of Los Mallitos Flacos, and they've been very active in Sonora. And ever since the Sinaloa Cartel Civil War between Los Mallitos Flacos and Los Chapitos, Los Rusos have been seen in Sinaloa fighting there on behalf of Los Mallitos Flacos against Los Chapitos, all the way down here in Sinaloa, highlighted over here. They still have a very important presence in Sonora. One of the interesting aspects, though, even before the 2023 break off of Los Chapitos, where we saw this independent cartel of Sonora formed, one of the key aspects that's interesting is Los Rusos also had a very violent conflict with Los Salazars. And so when the Sinaloa cartel was still, although there was two factions back then, Mayo Zambada and the Sons of Los Chapitos, a lot of the subgroups would fight between each other. And one of the key fightings that we saw historically in Sonora was between los Rusos and los Salazars, because los Salazars were part of los Chapitos, los Rusos, los Mayitos Flacos, well, back then Mayo Zambada, and they would battle each other out regularly, specifically in a town called San Luis Rio Colorado. Los Rusos and los Salazars were battling out. And again, this is before any of the split-offs, the official split-offs either in 2023 or 2024. Even before the formation of the independent cartel of Sonora, for example, one of the violence that we also saw in Sonora and that kind of the internal tensions within the Sinaloa cartel was between los cazadores or los alfa cazadores, also known as fantasmas, battling los delta pelones, right? Those two groups regularly battled it out, and that's one of the main reasons why there was also this split when los Salazar's cazadores and Paredes decided to form their own group, right? So Sonora always was a major focus for the Sinaloa cartel, but even before the 2023 split and 2024 split, even before that, Sonora also was the area where we saw most amount of internal tensions within the Sinaloa cartel, where various factions, either los Rusos against los Salazars or los Alfa Cazadores against los Delta Pelones, would fight out in Sonora. In 2023, again, that's when the independent cartel of Sonora was formed, and then the 2024, the Sinaloa cartel civil war, further split, just highlighted that violence. If you notice, los Rusos, in English, that's called the Russians, right? That's the name they use. And they use Russian flags, emojis, a lot in their propaganda but they're not affiliated with Russia or Putin. They're not loyal to Russia in any way, shape, or form. The reason why they call themselves the Russian is because the leader of los Rusos, his nickname is the Russian. And they call him El Ruso. And because that's his name, it's kind of like, I would tell people, it's almost like trolling by cartels that they use. And so they use heavily Russian and even Soviet symbols. And inside los Rusos, there's another important group really connected to los Rusos called los Limones, or the lemon. And so generally a lot of times what you would see, los Rusos have the Russian flag and then a lemon as well. And that indicates the alliance and the kind of the very connectedness of los Rusos with los Limones. The leader of los Limones is called P1, P1, and so those two are very inherently connected. But as I said earlier in this video, los Rusos historically had a lot of tension and fighting against los Salazars. So because los Rusos use the Russian flag, there is a faction of los Salazar called, they generally follow the leader, his, I believe his nickname is called the Chango. One of his main lieutenants leads a group called Fuerzas Especiales Dragones, or Dragon Special Forces, or just Dragones, the dragons. But what's interesting and pretty hilarious now is that since los Rusos use the Russian flag, we've now seen los Dragones use the Ukrainian flag. And they have been a lot more active in that type of propaganda warfare and trolling, where now you see los Salazars, a faction of los Salazars, specifically los Dragones, use the Ukrainian flag, and los Rusos use the Russian flag. And again, it's not because they're allied or they've been trained by Russia or Ukraine or they have a loyalty to these two countries. It's more of that internal cartel propaganda. And the best way to describe it is trolling between each other, because symbology is important for cartels and how they identify and how they operate on social media for propaganda arms, right? And one of the things I think it's for this video that I think is very important to highlight is that Sonora is a mess. I mean, the amount of violence in Sonora is astronomical. We see it around here, Hermosillo. We see it in Caborca. We see it in Guaymas, Ciudad Obregón. Like all these areas within Sonora have high levels of violence. And the problem that Sonora runs into, it's a very desert territory, right? It is not conducive for really anything else than a drug trafficking route into the United States. The reason why Sonora is so important is because they have access to Arizona. And so it's not that they manufacture their own drugs or anything like that in Sonora. They require those drugs to be sent from other areas through Sonora into Arizona. But not only drugs, also human smuggling, the migrants. The western route, I'm going to see if I can zoom out a little bit to highlight what I'm trying to, for the human smuggling route. Generally, what we've seen, especially during the first Trump administration and then the Biden administration, when really the migrant crisis was bad and people were coming in, there was multiple routes that people, of course that happens. calculate that out. There's multiple routes that migrants would take, right? One would be the eastern route, which was the quickest route. This was it, right? The east to the northeast of Mexico. The problem is, especially during the Biden administration and the first Trump administration, this was the most violent area, and it was extremely problematic for migrants to cross into here. Migrants would be kidnapped, they'd be extorted, they would be forced recruited into cartels to fight, and there was a violent civil war. It was the quickest route, but it was the most dangerous. So generally, the safest route was the western route, where they would go all the way to the west and try to get in through San Diego specifically, right, or through the Arizona area. This was longer, but back then it was a lot safer. So going back to Sonora, Sonora is one of those places where it's important to highlight that the violence that we see in the state can also be directly tied into controlling the human smuggling route specifically. A lot of the violence not only occurs in the cities, but along the highways that historically migrants would use to reach Arizona or San Diego. And so Sonora is an interesting case study where it is one of the few areas that we do see cartels actively battle for control of the human smuggling networks into the United States. And that's why Arizona generally saw a lot of migrants crossing through. And cartels would try to battle for control of that, not only just the drugs. And so the migrant crisis that flooded the United States, specifically through Sonora, was probably one of the main reasons then we saw a further split within the Sinaloa cartel back in 2023, when these Paredes, Cazadores, and Salazars broke off from Los Chapitos. Is because they wanted to have a predominant control of those human smuggling networks. And at the beginning, it did look like those Chapitos were gaining the upper hand, like 2023 till 2024. The Delta Pelones did look like they were getting the upper hand, but ever since the Sinaloa cartel civil war happened with the Mayito Flacos, started to attack Los Chapitos in Sinaloa, Los Chapitos have been losing control of large areas of Sonora. They still have a significant presence, but they have been losing control. And so now we're in a situation where we see, Los Chapitos, Los Mayito Flacos, and now this independent cartel of Sonora operating there. And the question we get asked a lot is there a possibility that in Sonora we might see Los Salazars, Los Cazadores, Los Paredes ally with Los Mayito Flacos? It is a possibility, but the problem is, as I alluded to earlier, there's a lot of bad blood between Los Rusos and Los Salazars. And again, Los Rusos have a huge presence, San Luis Rio Colorado, around this area, also the border of Sonora and Baja California, and they have a huge violence with Los Salazars in this area, specifically as highlighted here. So that's kind of a major impediment. But again, I don't want people to think that the independent cartel of Sonora is an actual unitary cartel. Maybe the best term is to say alliance, or maybe a confederation of those three groups, Los Salazars, Cazadores, and Paredes. But it's not like Los Mayito Flacos or like the Jalisco New Generation cartel, where you have one predominant leader that is known and he controls and dictates the fighting in Sonora. Here there's three groups that work together in kind of this confederation piece for overall control of Sonora. But yeah, that's kind of the main issue that we see. And it's important to highlight that Los Salazars, I talked about this in an earlier video, Los Salazars are attacking La Línea in Chihuahua. And it's kind of one of those interesting scenarios where even though the Salazars are fighting Los Rusos and the Mayito Flaco group in Sonora, if you look at Chihuahua, Los Salazars are fighting La Línea. Los Salazars also fight Los Chapitos in Sonora. But who also fights them is Los Mayito Flacos. The Mayito Flacos are fighting La Línea also in Chihuahua. So although the Rusos are the main impediment for this Mayito Flaco Salazar alliance, there could be a scenario where, let bygones be bygones, as we've seen in the past. Los Salazar and the Mayito Flacos decide to reach an agreement to fight their common enemy, which is both Los Chapitos in Sinaloa and in Sonora, as well as La Línea, the Nuevo Cartel de Juárez, and Chihuahua. So that's something I'm looking for in the future. Do we see reporting that the Mayito Flacos try to basically reach an agreement with Los Salazars so that the Rusos and the Salazar fighting stops, so that then they can focus on Los Chapitos and La Línea? That's something I'm looking for. We haven't necessarily seen it, but again, what's interesting is Los Rusos obviously have been more consumed to fight in Sinaloa against Los Chapitos down there. And although the Russos Salazar fighting still occurs in Sonora, it's at a lot lower intensity and level of violence than we saw historically in 2021, 2022, or 2023. Now, because of the Sinaloa Cartel civil war between Los Chapitos and Mayito Flaco, that has really consumed Los Russos much more than they're fighting against Los Salazars. But yeah, like I said, that's kind of the next area I'm going to be focusing on is the situation in between Los Salazar and Mayito Flacos. That's something I think it would be interesting to see if they get into some sort of agreement and basically the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But with that, I want to thank you all for listening to this video. Please let me know what you think. Please let me know what is the next state you want me to cover. And again, this is Stefano Rendale from All Source News. I hope you have a great rest of your day.